Imagine walking into a boardroom, right? You look a billionaire tech executive directly in the eye, and you tell them that the global financial system isn't actually real.
That it's just a myth.
Exactly, just a myth. Or picture stepping into a massive cathedral and telling a devout theologian that their most sacred foundational texts belong to the exact same, like, structural literary genre as a Marvel comic book.
You would definitely not be making any friends doing that.
No. If you did either of those things, you would immediately trigger a deeply defensive, probably hostile reaction.
Oh, absolutely.
And that is because, well, in our everyday lives, you and I use the word myth as a weapon.
Right. It's an accusation.
Yeah. We use it to call out a fake news story or to, dismiss some ridiculous internet diet trend or just to label something a flat-out lie.
We really crave that clean binary world. Things are either objective facts or they are complete falsehoods.
Right. But what if the way you are using that word is, well, fundamentally flawed? What if, according to the people who study the actual architecture of human belief for a living, our obsession with literal truth is just completely missing the point?
Because that obsession with objective veracity is actually a relatively modern affliction.
Right.
When you step out of everyday colloquial conversation and get into the rigorous academic study of folklore, anthropology, historical narrative, you experience this immediate and profound paradigm shift.
It's totally different.
Completely. In these academic circles, whether a myth is factually true or historically false is, well, it's entirely irrelevant to its classification.
Which is so hard to wrap your head around at first.
It is, because a scholar does not look at a narrative to fact-check it against the archaeological record. The true value, the actual defining characteristic of a myth, lies entirely in the societal function that the story serves.
So, welcome to this deep dive into the source material that unpacks the very machinery of human belief. We have gathered a fascinating stack of research today. It's this comprehensive look at the concept, the history, and the rigorous academic study of what a myth actually is.
It's a huge topic.
It really is. And our mission for this deep dive is to basically completely dismantle how you probably use this word every single day.
We have to break it down.
Yeah, we're going to explore how ordinary stories evolve into literal gods, trace this incredibly bizarre time-traveling etymology, and figure out how modern internet fan fiction is actually a direct continuation of ancient human behavior.
But to embark on this, we really first have to agree to leave our modern colloquial baggage right at the door.
Leave the weapons behind.
Exactly. We have to suspend our instinct to categorize the world into true and false, and instead we need to look at the world through the lens of function and structure.
Right.
We have to look at the stories cultures tell not as, documentaries, but as the load-bearing pillars of the society itself.
I love that phrase, load-bearing pillars. And that is a perfect transition into our first major paradigm shift, which is redefining the genres of the stories we tell.
Right, because if we are throwing out true versus false, we have to replace it with something else.
We need a new way to categorize human storytelling based on what these stories are actually doing for the people who tell them. And in the academic world, the sources say folklorists have mapped out what they call the folklore ecosystem.
The folklore ecosystem, yes. It's a highly structured way of organizing traditional narratives.
Because there's just so many of them.
Right. There's a vast ocean of human storytelling. So folklorists draw these distinct, deliberate boundaries to make sense of it all. Academically speaking, a myth is defined as a folklore genre consisting of narratives that play a fundamental foundational role in a society.
Foundational.
Yes, these are narratives that are often explicitly endorsed by the authorities of that society, whether those authorities are religious or secular.
But the research makes it clear you cannot truly understand what a myth is just by looking at it in isolation.
Right. No, you can't. It only comes into focus when you place it next to its two closest narrative siblings, which are the legend and the folktale.
Okay, let's break down those boundaries, because this is where the architecture really starts to show. If we look at the first category, myths, there are very specific criteria here.
Very specific.
Myths almost exclusively feature non-humans as their main characters. So the protagonists are gods, demigods, or other profoundly supernatural figures.
But beyond just the cast of characters, it's the temporal setting that gives a myth its absolute weight.
The when, not just the who.
Exactly. The setting is paramount. Myths are set in the remote past. However, we are not simply talking about a long time ago in a strictly historical sense.
Right, it's not like saying in the year 1200.
No, we are talking about a primordial age. This is a conceptual epoch before the world had even achieved its current physical or moral form.
The before time.
The before time. And because they deal with this foundational before time, they are universally considered sacred narratives by the cultures that hold them.
They carry that heavy reverence.
They do. They serve the very specific structural purpose of providing origin stories. A myth explains how a society's specific customs, its institutions, its deepest taboos, and the very landscape itself were established and sanctified by divine action.
Wow, okay. So a myth gives you the sacred origin. It's the bedrock. Contrast that with the second category in this ecosystem, which is legends.
Right. Legends operate on an entirely different frequency because their main characters are human.
Not gods.
Right. Now, they might be extraordinary humans,
Yeah.
towering chiefs, legendary kings, cunning heroes, but they remain mortals. They are bound by human limitations.
And the setting is different too, right?
Completely. Legends possess some sort of historical basis, or at the very least, they are presented to the audience as having occurred in historical time.
So they map onto our actual timeline.
Yes. They deal with tangible human events, the migrations of tribes, great wars, victories, the succession of ruling dynasties.
That distinction regarding time seems crucial. Legends are set in our world in a time we can theoretically point to on a timeline, whereas myths occur in that unmappable primordial void.
Precisely. And because legends deal with the actions of mortals within historical time, they are generally considered secular rather than sacred.
No.
If myths represent the divine origin of a people, legends represent the historical continuity of a people.
They bridge the gap.
Exactly. They bridge the gap between the divine actions of the primordial past and the mundane reality of the present day.
Okay, which brings us to the third category in the ecosystem.
Yeah.
The folktale. And the sources describe the folktale as almost the exact opposite of the myth.
Folktales are perhaps the easiest to categorize, honestly, because of the unspoken contract between the storyteller and the audience.
Right, everybody knows what's happening.
Yes. A folktale, so think of a classic fairy tale, is not considered historically or literally true by anyone involved in the exchange.
Right, nobody thinks Cinderella actually happened.
Exactly. The teller knows it is fiction, and the listener knows it is fiction. They are entirely distinct from the other two categories because they lack both the sacred, load-bearing weight of the myth and the historical anchoring of the legend.
Okay, so I was thinking about this and I came up with an analogy.
Let's hear it.
So if a legend is essentially a historical biopic movie that takes a few creative liberties for the sake of pacing.
Right, like a movie based on a true story.
Yeah. And a folktale is a purely fictional summer blockbuster designed exclusively to entertain you for 2 hours.
Okay.
Then a myth is more like the society's actual operating system. It is the invisible, foundational code running in the background, dictating how everything works, determining why the cultural icons are where they are, and establishing the fundamental rules of the world.
That operating system analogy is highly effective. I really like that. Because every complex society needs all three tiers to function properly.
They all do different jobs.
Yes. It needs the folk tale for entertainment, emotional release, maybe some basic moral instruction. It needs the legend to map its historical progression, providing the citizens with a sense of, shared secular identity.
Right.
But it absolutely requires the myth, the operating system, to provide the bedrock framework. The myth acts as the primordial code from which all other societal norms, legal structures, and spiritual values ultimately boot up.
But as with any attempt to perfectly categorize human behavior, the sources are quick to point out that these boundaries are incredibly messy in practice.
Oh, very messy. History does not like rigid boxes.
No, it really doesn't.
The overlaps are where the study becomes truly fascinating. If you look at classical epics like the Greek Iliad and Odyssey or the Roman Aeneid, you see these boundaries totally blurring.
Right, because you have real places, but also magic.
Exactly. In these narratives, you have humans and gods interacting directly. They are set in a semi-historical timeline dealing with human wars and migrations, which is the stuff of legends, yet they carry the profound foundational weight and divine presence of a sacred myth.
And the direction of this transformation can actually go both ways, which is wild. The source material highlights how deeply historical, documented events can acquire mythological qualities over centuries.
Yes, the academic terms for this process are the matter of Britain and the matter of France.
Which sound very official.
They do. So the matter of Britain is the collective body of literature encompassing King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table.
Oh, yeah?
And the matter of France encompasses the legends of Charlemagne and his paladins. These are perfect test cases for the fluidity of narrative.
Because they started as real things.
Yes. The Arthurian legends distantly originate from actual, documented historical skirmishes in the 5th century during the Saxon invasions.
The regular guys fighting.
Just regular warfare. And the matter of grants stems from specific 8th century military campaigns. Yet over hundreds of years, as these stories were retold, exaggerated, and repurposed to serve changing political and spiritual needs.
The truth just stretches.
It does. Those historical kernels were entirely mythologized. Kings became divinely chosen saviors, and mere historical battles became these cosmic struggles between good and evil.
So the history becomes the operating system.
Exactly.
So to truly understand how this foundational operating system got its name, the sources take us through the etymology of the word myth. And let me tell you, the history of this word is incredibly backward.
It really is.
It is this time-traveling linguistic journey that completely defies how we usually assume language develops.
The linguistic progression is just full of unexpected detours. We have to begin in ancient Greece with the root word mothos.
Okay.
In its earliest usage, mokos was an incredibly broad term that simply meant speech, narrative, thought, or fiction.
So it didn't mean anything magical.
No, it had no inherently sacred or foundational connotation whatsoever.
It was just a generic placeholder for words coming out of someone's mouth.
Exactly. The Greeks later combined mokos with the suffix logia, which denotes the study or telling of something.
Right, like biology or geology.
Right. And this created the word mythology, translating roughly to storytelling or the telling of legends. Even then, the philosopher Plato used mythologia as a very general, almost dismissive term for fiction or imaginative storytelling of any kind.
So even the great Greek philosophers were not using this word to describe the sacred operating system.
They were not.
So when did the academic narrowing of the definition actually begin?
That narrowing began much later. A critical turning point occurred in the 5th century CE with a Latin author named Fabius Planciades Fulgentius.
Fulgentius?
Yes. He compiled a work titled Mythologiae, and he used the term specifically to denote Greco-Roman etiological stories, the specific narratives involving the ancient gods.
Okay, so he's the one who locked it in.
He was a major part of it. What makes Fulgentius pivotal is that he explicitly treated these stories as allegories. He approached them not as literal historical events, but as symbolic narratives that required deep intellectual interpretation to extract moral or philosophical truths.
He essentially invented the academic study of the stories, like treating them as complex puzzles rather than historical documentaries.
He did. Now, from those Greek roots, the term passed into late Latin, and from Latin it was eventually adopted into Middle French as mythology.
Okay, tracking.
But this is where the timeline becomes incredibly strange for English speakers. English adopted the word mythology in the 15th century. Its first attested use is in John Lydgate's Troy book, which was composed around the year 1425.
Wait, 1425? That is over 500 years ago. What did that word even mean to an English speaker in 1425?
Well, in the 15th century, mythology meant the exposition of a myth, the interpretation of fables, or it referred directly to a book of such expositions.
So it was a study of the stories.
Yes. From Lydgate's era all the way through the 17th and 18th centuries, the word mythology essentially functioned as a blanket term for a moral fable, or a collection of traditional stories that were understood by the Christian European speakers to be entirely false. It became the overarching label applied to the traditional belief systems of polytheistic cultures around the globe.
And this is the chronological gap that completely stands out in the research. It blew my mind.
It's wild.
The word mythology entered the English language in 1425. But the singular word myth, referring to just one individual story, did not appear in English until 1830.
The chronological gap is massive. I mean, if you consult Samuel Johnson's Foundational Dictionary published in 1755.
Which was the standard, right?
Exactly. You will find a prominent, detailed entry for mythology, but there is absolutely no entry for the singular word myth.
That is so weird.
Prior to 1830, if an English speaker wanted to refer to a single story, they were forced to use the Greek loanword mythos, or the Latin et mythos. The straightforward English singular noun myth simply did not exist in the cultural vocabulary.
The implication of that gap is just staggering. It is the equivalent of a culture inventing the word library in the year 1400, but failing to invent the word book until the 1830s.
That's a great way to put it.
How does an entire academic culture study the forest for 400 years without ever bothering to name the individual trees?
When you view that gap through the lens of intellectual history, it reveals the profound biases of the era.
Because they didn't care about the trees.
Exactly. Early European scholars were intensely focused on the macroscopic level. They were interested in the collections of foreign polytheistic beliefs because they viewed mythology as a collective phenomenon, often characterizing it as the collective error or spiritual darkness of pagan societies. They did not view a single myth as a discrete functional unit of human narrative worthy of individual, respectful structural analysis. They were judging the entirety of a foreign culture's belief system from a distance.
They were looking at a competing operating system, labeling the entire thing a virus, and therefore they saw no reason to examine the individual lines of code.
That is exactly what they were doing.
It wasn't until the 19th century that scholars actually began to dissect the individual components, which finally necessitated the birth of the singular word myth in the English language.
And once they recognized the individual unit, they faced a new, even more difficult challenge: how to define it.
Right, because now you have to pin it down.
Yes. The attempt to forge a universal definition for a concept that encompasses the most sacred, deeply held beliefs of diverse human populations. It's a linguistic and philosophical minefield.
The source material presents several definitions that scholars have wrestled with over the years. One of the most prominent comes from the Finnish folklorist Lauri Honko.
Anka's definition is widely cited because of its structural rigor. He states that a myth is a story of the gods, a religious account of the beginning of the world, the creation, fundamental events, the exemplary deeds of the gods, as a result of which the world, nature, and culture were created together with all parts thereof and given their order, which still obtains.
Okay, let's dissect that because there is an immense amount of pressure on the phrase, given their order, which still obtains.
Yes, that's the key.
Under Honko's framework, a myth is intensely active in the present moment. It is not merely a historical curiosity or, a story told around a fire for entertainment. It is the active blueprint for how society functions today. It dictates the current order.
That is the essence of Honko's functional approach. He elaborates that a myth actively expresses and confirms a society's religious values and norms.
It's doing work.
Yes. It provides a rigid pattern of behavior intended to be imitated by the populace. It testifies to the efficacy of the society's rituals and establishes the absolute sanctity of their cultic practices.
So it is the justification for every law and every ritual. But modern thinkers approach the definition with a slightly different philosophical angle. The sources introduce Professor José Manuel Losada, whose definition moves away from just the mechanics of ritual.
Losada offers a more transcendent perspective. He defines myth as a narrative of extraordinary events that lacks, in principle, historical testimony, but possesses a transcendent, sacred referent.
That's a dense definition.
It is. He places heavy emphasis on the idea that a myth refers to an absolute cosmogony or an absolute eschatology.
Okay, those are some heavy theological terms. So cosmogony referring to theories regarding the origin of the universe.
Right.
And eschatology referring to the ultimate destiny of humanity, or the end of the world. Losada's definition, lacking historical testimony but having a transcendent referent, feels like an acknowledgement of the limits of science.
So?
Well, he seems to be saying that we cannot prove these narratives with archaeological digging, right? But the stories point toward a profound psychological or spiritual truth that is much larger than material evidence.
That interpretation aligns perfectly with the underlying tension in modern myth studies. And it brings us directly to the profound religious controversy surrounding the word itself.
Because, as we established earlier, the general public overwhelmingly uses myth to imply something that is objectively untrue.
Right.
And because of that colloquial baggage, applying the word myth to living, breeding religions creates immense friction. Identifying a currently worshipped narrative as a myth is highly controversial.
Extremely.
Billions of religious adherents across the globe believe firmly that the sacred narratives within their respective traditions are unquestionable historical facts. Naturally, they strongly object to their sacred texts being labeled as myths.
And the controversy is compounded by a frequent double standard.
Oh, yeah.
Adherents of one tradition might be deeply offended if their own foundational stories are termed myths, while simultaneously feeling perfectly comfortable using that exact same word to describe the foundational narratives of every other religion on Earth.
It is a linguistic defense mechanism born out of deep faith. The unspoken rule seems to be, my story is verified history, your story is misguided mythology.
Scholars are acutely, sometimes painfully, aware of this tension. To avoid the pejorative overtones and the sheer cultural arrogance of depreciating one living tradition while elevating another, many academics have adopted a strict policy.
What's the policy?
Labeling all religious narratives as myths impartially. It is an attempt to level the analytical playing field.
Just a blanket rule.
Exactly. Conversely, other scholars choose to abstain from using the term myth altogether when discussing living religions. They'll opt for terms like sacred narrative to avoid causing unnecessary offense while still maintaining analytical rigor.
The research also points out how biblical scholars have carved out their own specific, highly technical application of the word to navigate this exact tension. They use the word myth technically to describe stories that describe the actions of the otherworldly in terms of this world.
That specific academic usage is a brilliant circumvention of the truth-value debate.
It really is.
Within that discipline, referring to the creation narrative or the fall in Genesis as a myth is not a judgment on its factual reality. It is an acknowledgement of the narrative's function.
It's structural.
Yes. It uses the limited physical language of human experience to describe the ultimately incomprehensible actions of the divine realm.
The power of this narrative structure is so potent that modern fiction writers have deliberately attempted to hijack it.
Oh, absolutely.
The sources bring up J.R.R. Tolkien, who actually coined the term mythopoeia, which translates to the conscious generation of mythology.
Right.
He sat down with deliberate intent to write a new, foundational operating system for his fictional world of Middle-earth. Similarly, H.P. Lovecraft's interconnected cosmic horror plots are famously referred to as the Cthulhu mythos.
The efforts of Tolkien and Lovecraft demonstrate a deep, intuitive understanding of narrative architecture. They were not satisfied with writing mere folk tales or legends. They were actively attempting to artificially engineer the psychological weight, the internal consistency, and the profound depth that characterizes actual organic myths.
Even recognizing that technical brilliance, though, I think there was necessary pushback regarding the concept of academic neutrality.
What do you mean?
Well, even if scholars have developed a perfectly neutral, functional definition for the word myth, isn't there an inherent blindness in applying it to deeply held, current religious beliefs, knowing full well that the vast majority of the public hears the word as a synonym for lie?
That's a fair point.
If an anthropologist walks up to a community leader and says, "Your sacred beliefs is a fascinating myth," they cannot simply hide behind a textbook definition when the community leader feels insulted.
That pushback touches on the fundamental power dynamics of language. Language does not exist in a sterile academic vacuum.
No, it doesn't.
Historically, applying the label of myth has absolutely been an act of depreciation. It has been utilized as a colonial weapon by dominant cultures to invalidate, diminish, and eventually erase the sacred narratives of subjugated cultures.
The rhetoric of empire.
Oh.
We possess true religion and history. You possess quaint mythology.
Precisely. However, from the strict perspective of the analytical scholar, suspending all judgment regarding objective truth is an absolute prerequisite for understanding societal truth.
You have to step back.
You do. If a researcher embeds themselves in a culture and spends their time trying to determine if the local stories are factually true, they will entirely miss the structural function of the narrative.
They miss the forest for the trees again.
Exactly. The scholar's task is not to validate the historical archaeology of the story. Their task is to understand the mechanisms by which the story prevents the society from disintegrating. But translating that necessary academic neutrality into the volatile public sphere remains an incredibly fraught endeavor.
If merely defining the boundary of a myth can spark a geopolitical or theological incident, the complexity only multiplies when we examine the theories regarding why human beings started inventing these narratives in the first place.
Why do we do it?
Exactly. The source material outlines 6 major academic theories that attempt to explain the genesis of myth.
And it's important to note, these 6 theories do not necessarily cancel each other out.
Right. They aren't mutually exclusive.
No. Instead, they represent 6 distinct analytical lenses through which we can observe the human mind struggling to process, organize, and survive an overwhelming universe.
Let's explore these lenses. The first theory presented is comparative mythology.
Comparative mythology is fundamentally the search for the ultimate narrative source code.
The original blueprint.
Yes. Scholars utilizing this framework systematically compare myths from drastically different, geographically isolated cultures around the world. They search for underlying universal themes.
Like what?
like the catastrophic global flood, the mischievous trickster figure, the dying and resurrecting god. By analyzing these striking similarities, some comparative mythologists argue that these diverse mythologies all diverge from a common ancestral source, a singular proto-mythology that ancient humans shared before migrating and spreading across the continents.
It is the narrative equivalent of evolutionary biology, tracking the DNA of a story back through millennia to find a single hypothetical ancestor.
Exactly right.
The second lens is functionalism, which we touched upon earlier with Lori Honko, but the research introduces other prominent voices here.
Functionalism posits that myths do not exist to explain the natural world, but rather to form, shape, and maintain society and social behavior.
It's the glue.
Right. The prominent scholar Mircea Eliade argued that myths establish models for human behavior and provide a conduit for profound religious experience.
Okay.
Eliade believed that by reciting or ritually reenacting myths, members of traditional societies effectively detach themselves from the mundane, linear progression of the present moment and spiritually return to the mythical age, thereby bringing themselves closer to the divine presence.
It functions as an elaborate escape hatch from the chaotic grind of everyday survival, allowing the community to anchor themselves in the sacred.
Yes.
The sources mention the author Devdutt Pattanaik in this context, providing a quote that brilliantly distills this entire concept. He says, "Facts are everybody's truth. Fiction is nobody's truth. Myths are somebody's truth."
That is such a great quote. Pattanaik's distillation is profoundly accurate within the functionalist framework.
It really hits the nail on the head.
It does, because a myth is completely absolved of the burden of being everybody's empirical fact. Its only requirement is to serve as the vital organizing truth for the specific somebody, the specific community that believes it and relies upon it for their cultural survival.
Okay, the third theory shifts the focus entirely. It is called euhemerism, named after an ancient Greek philosopher.
Yes, Euhemerus, who lived around the late 4th century BCE.
What was his deal?
Euhemerism is the highly pragmatic theory that myths are actually just distorted, highly elaborated accounts of real historical events and actual human beings.
So, regular people.
Right. According to this framework, oral storytellers take a mundane historical account and, over centuries of retelling, elaborate on the details until the human figures within the story are elevated to the status of literal, immortal gods.
The research provides a phenomenal example of this process using the Greek myth of the wind god, Aeolus. The euhemerist theory suggests that Aeolus might have originally just been a highly observant historical king who figured out how to utilize sails on ships and then taught his people how to interpret local weather patterns.
Which, to a coastal people dependent on rowing, a king who harnesses the wind would be viewed as an absolute genius.
Oh, totally.
The theory posits a generational game of telephone. The king's immediate descendants might say, "Our grandfather knew a man who could catch the wind."
Right.
Several generations later, the story morphs into, "Our ancestors knew a man who commanded the wind." Hundreds of years later, all historical context is lost, and the narrative crystallizes. Aeolus is the immortal entity who physically controls the wind. Historical reality is continuously inflated until it reaches divine proportions.
It's the ultimate fish story. The fourth theory attempts to explain the origin of gods not through exaggerated history, but through language, the allegorical theory.
The allegorical approach proposes that myths began as symbolic, poetic descriptions for natural phenomena or complex philosophical concepts.
But then people forgot the poetry.
Yes. Over time, the symbolic nature was forgotten. For example, Apollo was originally just a symbol representing the sun, Poseidon a symbol for water, Athena a symbol for wise judgment.
Okay.
But the most famous and perhaps most controversial proponent of a specific linguistic type of allegory was the 19th century scholar Max Muller.
Miller's theory is wildly creative. He called it the disease of language.
Yes. Miller theorized that myths began as poetic descriptions of the natural world, but over vast stretches of time, these descriptions were taken literally because ancient languages possessed severe structural limitations.
Wait, structural limitation, like what?
Specifically, he argued that early languages lacked abstract nouns and neuter genders. Therefore, early humans were forced to describe the world using anthropomorphic language. He viewed mythology as a literal disease or malfunction of human language.
To make that abstract concept concrete, consider how ancient people might describe a terrifying storm at sea. Because their language lacks the abstract meteorological terminology to describe barometric pressure or weather systems, they rely on figures of speech. They look at the crashing waves and say, the seas are raging today, or the sea is angry.
Which, in its original context, is simply a poetic way of stating that the waves are dangerous.
Right, it's just a metaphor.
But Miller argued that as generations pass, the poetic nuance of the phrase evaporates. The descendants hear the oral tradition and take it literally.
They process it as a fact.
Yes, they process the language linearly. Our ancestors said the sea is an angry person, therefore the sea must be a conscious, raging deity. The metaphor involuntarily literalizes itself due to the limitations of vocabulary.
There's a profound irony there. Mueller is essentially suggesting the human language completely failed us, and out of that catastrophic failure of communication, we accidentally birthed entire pantheons of deities.
That is essentially his argument.
That leads naturally into the fifth theory, personification.
Personification shares DNA with allegory, but operates on a broader psychological scale.
How so?
Thinkers in this camp argue that ancient humans worshipped natural phenomena directly. The raw power of fire, the necessity of air, the life-giving nature of water, and gradually endowed these inanimate forces with personal, divine attributes.
So they saw the fire and worshipped it, and then slowly decided the fire had a personality.
Exactly. Ancient humanity tended to view the world not as a collection of inert matter governed by physical laws, but as an active environment filled with entities possessing will and intention. Therefore, a devastating thunderstorm is not a random meteorological event. It is the deliberate, personal act of an angry sky god.
Which brings us to the final of the six theories, ritualism. And I love this one because it completely inverts the logical sequence we usually assume.
It does. Ritualism is most closely associated with the prominent scholars William Robertson Smith and James George Frazer.
Okay.
We generally operate under the assumption that a society develops a myth first and then subsequently creates a physical ritual to honor or enact that myth.
Like you have the story of the flood, so you do a water ritual.
Right, but ritualism argues the exact opposite. The action precedes the narrative.
The text explains that communities begin performing rituals for reasons entirely unrelated to any grand cosmic story. Perhaps it is a practical agricultural habit or an archaic magical belief meant to ward off disease.
Right.
But as centuries pass, the original practical reason they started doing the ritual is completely forgotten.
Yet the community refuses to abandon the ritual. Humans are creatures of intense habit, and traditional actions provide immense psychological comfort.
We love a routine.
We do. So, a society finds itself compulsively performing a complex ritual without knowing why. To resolve this cognitive dissonance, they invent a myth.
They work backward.
Yes, they reverse engineer a sacred story that claims the ritual commemorates a specific divine event, effectively providing a profound justification for their unexplained habit.
When reading this, a perfectly mundane modern analogy came to mind. The act of blowing out candles on a birthday cake.
Oh, that's interesting. How does that apply to the ritualist theory?
Think about the physical action. We place tiny burning fires on top of a baked pastry, and then the person celebrating their birth forcefully exhales over the food to extinguish the flames.
It sounds bizarre when you say it like that.
Right. We have likely completely forgotten the original ancient magical or perhaps purely practical reason humanity started doing this.
Yeah.
But we refused to stop doing it because it was tradition. So to account for this incredibly strange behavior, we constructed a minor myth. We invented the narrative of make a secret wish and the smoke will carry it to the heavens to make it come true. We invented the story to justify why we keep spitting on perfectly good pastry every single year.
That is a brilliant, highly accessible application of the ritualist theory. The physical action is ancient and habitual, while the narrative explanation is a retroactive construct.
We just can't handle doing something for no reason.
Exactly. The human mind abhors a vacuum of meaning, so when faced with an unexplained tradition, we construct a narrative architecture to fill that void.
When we look at all six of these theories, comparative mythology, functionalism, euhemerism, allegory, personification, and ritualism, the underlying psychological through line is just fascinating.
It connects them all.
Every single one of these theories frames the creation of myth as a vital coping mechanism.
It's a survival tool.
Whether humanity is attempting to explain a forgotten behavioral habit through ritualism, or desperately trying to understand a terrifying, life-threatening storm through personification, myth is the fundamental psychological tool we use to impose structure, meaning, and order onto a chaotic, indifferent universe.
It is humanity's attempt to run a diagnostic on an environment that does not naturally offer explanations. And these six theories did not simply emerge simultaneously either.
No, it took a while.
The source material maps out a staggering, centuries-long timeline of how academic thought regarding myth evolved, an intellectual journey that begins in the agoras of ancient Greece and ultimately arrives on the psychoanalytic couch of Sigmund Freud.
The history of how we study the stories is almost as complex as the stories themselves.
It's a whole other layer.
The timeline begins with the pre-Socratic philosophers in ancient Greece, and specifically with Plato. They were among the very first to subject myths to critical structural interpretation. But Plato famously condemned poetic myths when outlining his ideal education system in the Republic.
Yes, Plato's condemnation was rooted in a profound fear of literalism.
What was he afraid of?
He was deeply concerned that the uneducated masses would absorb the wild, chaotic, and often immoral narratives of the Olympian gods, stories involving deceit, violence, and infidelity.
Because the Greek gods were awful people.
They were terrible role models. He feared people would interpret them as literal models for human behavior, and that the stories would corrupt the civic morals of the state.
Which makes sense.
Yet the great irony of Plato is that he constantly employed complex, original mythical structures, like the myth of the cave or the myth of Ur, throughout his own philosophical writings, to elucidate concepts that rational argument alone could not capture.
So he hated the old myths, but made up his own when he needed them. The Greeks were clearly conflicted about their own operating system.
And very conflicted.
The text notes that later Greek thinkers, the Neoplatonists, pushed back against Plato's condemnation by advocating for purely symbolic interpretations. A writer named Silistius went so far as to divide myths into 5 distinct, highly sophisticated categories: theological, physical, animistic, material, and mixed.
Silistius's categorization was an attempt to save the myths from the charge of absurdity.
How did that work?
Well, by labeling a myth as physical, for instance, he argued that the story was not actually about a god acting immorally, but was instead a coded representation of physical laws, the interaction of earth, water, and fire.
Oh, that's clever.
Right. Theological myths, in his view, dealt with the incorporeal nature of the divine, using physical symbols only because the human mind cannot grasp pure nothingness. The Greeks were already engaging in a highly advanced form of literary deconstruction.
We then leap forward dramatically in the timeline to the 19th century, where the entire academic atmosphere changes. The research emphasizes that this era was heavily driven by romantic nationalism, championed by figures like Jacob Grimm, famous for the Brothers Grimm fairy tales, and it was fundamentally shaped by the massive global reach of European colonialism.
The 19th century represents a seismic shift. European scholars were suddenly gaining access to incredibly ancient, newly translated texts like the Sanskrit Rig Veda from India and the Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh from Mesopotamia.
A huge influx of data.
Yes. Simultaneously, colonial expansion brought them into direct contact with the living, incredibly diverse oral traditions of indigenous populations across the Americas, Africa, and Australia.
And they processed all of this incoming data through the dominant scientific lens of their time: Darwinian evolution.
Yes, evolutionary thought permeated every academic discipline. 19th century scholars forcibly fitted mythology into a unilineal evolutionary framework.
Meaning a straight line.
Right. They operated under the assumption that all human cultures travel along a single, predetermined, linear path of intellectual development. Prominent figures like Edward Burnett Tyler and James George Frazer, the author of the influential book The Golden Bough, viewed myth essentially as primitive science.
Bad science.
Exactly. They believed the human mind progressed through 3 rigid stages. It began with magical thinking, evolved into religious and mythical thinking, and would ultimately culminate in the triumph of pure, rational modern science.
It is impossible to ignore the immense hubris of that era. European scholars sat in their comfortable Victorian drawing rooms, reading translated texts, and utterly convinced themselves that they stood at the absolute pinnacle of human intellectual evolution.
It's astounding.
They framed myth as a failed mode of thought. They assumed that because modern science could explain the hydrological cycle of rain, humanity would simply abandon the psychological need for a rain god.
And that hubris extended to how they sanitized the past, too. We discussed Max Mueller earlier, who developed nature mythology.
Right, the disease of language guy.
Yes. This approach was incredibly popular because it allowed Victorian scholars to deal with the deeply taboo elements of ancient texts.
Taboo like what?
Well, If a newly translated Greek or Sanskrit myth featured elements deeply offensive to Victorian sensibilities, such as incest, cannibalism, or chaotic violence, scholars would bend over backward to explain it away as a mere poetic metaphor.
Oh, they couldn't handle the weird stuff.
Not at all. They would argue the god is not actually consuming his children. That is simply a clumsy agricultural metaphor for the winter harvest consuming the spring crops.
That is quite the stretch.
It was a desperate attempt to make the raw, chaotic, ancient world palatable and logical.
But the flaw in Fraser and Tyler's unilineal theory is glaring. If they truly believed that empirical science would naturally render myth obsolete, they completely misunderstood the fundamental needs of the human psyche.
They really did.
Trying to replace a myth with a scientific fact is like trying to replace a warm hug with a digital thermometer.
I love that. Elaborate on the thermometer analogy.
Okay, so science is the thermometer. It is incredibly vital. It gives you perfectly accurate, objective data about the environment. It tells you the exact temperature of the room. But myth is the warm hug. A thermometer cannot offer you any comfort when you are paralyzed by the fear of death, or when you are grieving the loss of a child, or when you are desperately seeking a sense of connection and purpose within your community. 19th century scholars erroneously believed that objective data could fully replace emotional and structural comfort.
That is a phenomenal critique, and it perfectly anticipates the violent intellectual awakening of the 20th century.
Which was a rough century.
It was. The 20th century brutally dismantled the arrogant optimism of the 19th century. The catastrophic devastation of the First and Second World Wars proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that scientific advancement, which brought the world machine guns, mustard gas, and atomic weapons, did not naturally lead to moral utopia.
Science gave us weapons, not peace.
Exactly. Thinkers realized that science, for all its immense power, could not cure human anxiety or provide structural spiritual meaning to a human life.
Which sets the stage for the psychological turn. Enter Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung.
Precisely. In the early 20th century, psychoanalytical approaches completely revolutionized the study of myth. Sigmund Freud drew heavy inspiration from classical mythology to develop his controversial psychological concepts, most notably the Oedipus complex. Freud viewed myths not as failed science, but as the collective, externalized dreams of a society, allowing cultures to process deeply repressed desires and anxieties.
So it's therapy on a societal level.
Exactly. And then Carl Jung pushed this concept even further into the realm of the universal. He theorized that all human beings share innate, unconscious psychological forces, which he termed archetypes.
Archetypes?
Yes. Jung argued that the astonishing similarities found in myths across isolated global cultures are undeniable proof of a shared collective unconscious inherited by all humanity.
The focus shifted entirely inward. The story was no longer an explanation of the weather. It was a map of the human brain.
Oh.
And following the psychologists, the structuralists entered the fray.
Claude Lévi-Strauss was the titan of 20th century structuralism. He argued that myths do not merely reflect repressed desires, they reflect the fixed physical patterns of the human brain itself.
Okay, that sounds intense.
He posited that the human mind inherently organizes the world into binary opposites: good and evil, light and dark, raw and cooked, compassionate and callous. Myths, therefore, are the narrative expressions of these fundamental cognitive structures, striving to resolve irreconcilable contradictions in human existence.
Wow. And while Lévi-Strauss was mapping the brain, the anthropologist Bronislaw Malinowski was looking at how myths operate in the physical community.
Right.
He introduced the concept of the mythic charter, arguing that myths serve to validate and legitimize current social norms, land ownership, and power structures in the real world.
They justify who is in charge.
Exactly. Later, thinkers like Roland Barthes transitioned into post-structuralism, analyzing how these exact same mythic structures operate invisibly within modern secular popular culture and advertising.
The sources also detail how the increasing secularization of the West triggered a profound theological reassessment.
How so?
Well, the scholar Mircea Eliade argued vehemently that the pervasive anxieties and neuroses of modern humans are actually the direct consequence of our rejection of myth and our loss of connection to the sacred.
We lost our anchor.
Yes. Conversely, the theologian Rudolf Bultmann argued that to save Christianity in the modern era, the New Testament needed to be thoroughly demythologized, stripped of its miraculous first-century narrative structures to reveal the core existential truths beneath.
But pushing back against Bultmann, the American theologian Conrad Hyers wrote an impassioned defense of myth. Hires argued that myths are not the opposite of truth, nor are they a husk to be discarded.
Right.
He asserted that myths are the only vehicles capable of carrying supreme, ultimate truth regarding human existence. Truths that are far too vast for empirical science to contain.
The intellectual journey from the 19th to the 20th century represents a complete philosophical reversal.
A full 180.
Totally. Instead of dismissing myth as the foolish error of primitive minds, 20th century scholarship recognized myth as an absolute emotional, psychological, and societal necessity. A foundational architecture that objective science is fundamentally incapable of replacing.
This profound realization completely shattered how we approach the texts themselves today. We stopped searching for the true original version and started examining the individual fragments. This brings us to the 21st century and the postmodern liberation of the myth.
The postmodern influence on mythology has been incredibly disruptive, but in the best possible way.
How did it disrupt things?
For centuries, scholars operated under the assumption that there existed a perfect, uncorrupted, original version of every myth, and that all the localized variations they encountered in the field were simply degraded, imperfect copies born of faulty memory.
Like a bad photocopy.
Exactly. Postmodernism argued the exact opposite. Myths are inherently plastic, fluid, and relentlessly variable. The search for the original version is a fool's errand because there is no such thing.
The research highlights a famous essay by the scholar A.K. Ramanujan titled 300 Ramayanas as the perfect example of this.
It's a landmark piece of writing.
The Ramayana is a foundational Indian epic, but Ramanujan points out that there are hundreds of wildly different versions across different regions, languages, and religions. You cannot point to one manuscript and declare it the true Ramayana.
Right.
The hundreds of variations are, collectively, the Ramayana. Furthermore, modern scholars have finally moved away from their obsession with written text.
That is a vital methodological shift. For a long time, Western academics prioritized written manuscripts above all else. Today, scholars fully recognize that mythology is rarely confined to the written word.
It's everywhere.
Yes, the physical landscape, the names of local rivers, the visual arts, ritual dances, and oral performances are just as vital to the transmission and survival of mythology as any written epic. The medium is fluid.
But the most fascinating modern development detailed in our sources has to be the methodology known as hylistics.
Hylistics represents the absolute cutting edge of structural analysis. It is a highly rigorous methodology developed by Annette and Christian Skoll at the University of Göttingen.
And they propose a radical idea. They argue that myths are not texts at all. They utilize a specific German term, Erzählstoffe.
Erzählstoffe translates roughly to narrative materials, or the raw substance of a story.
Okay.
The Skolls argue that to truly analyze a myth, you must completely strip it out of its specific cultural medium, whether it is an ancient Greek poem, a modern Hollywood movie, or a traditional indigenous dance. You must take that raw narrative material and break it down into its smallest possible, indivisible plot components.
The atoms of this story.
Exactly, and they call these microscopic narrative atoms hylemes.
Hylemes.
Yes. By isolating these individual hylemes, scholars can organize them into standard sequences and perform what is called a hyleme analysis.
What does that let them do?
This painstaking process allows them to observe the stratification, the overlapping layers of narrative variants, and objectively compare wildly diverse, seemingly unrelated materials across completely different cultures and epochs.
The concept of the hyleme is absolutely brilliant. It means that modern scholars are finally treating the architecture of human storytelling like a box of Lego bricks.
I love that. Let's explore the Lego analogy. Like, how does it align with hyleme analysis?
So imagine you go to the store and purchase a brand new Lego set designed to build an ancient Greek pirate ship. You follow the instructions, you build it, and it functions perfectly as a Greek ship.
Okay, tracking.
But then you completely disassemble it. Suddenly, those exact same basic bricks, the individual hylemes, are just sitting in a pile. You can take those exact same fundamental bricks and reconstruct them to build a Native American creation story, or a Norse apocalyptic sequence, or a modern science fiction spaceship.
Oh, wow.
The bricks themselves, the hylemes, are entirely universal. Humanity possesses a shared narrative toolkit. But the final build, the specific way those bricks are snapped together and presented, is entirely localized to the unique needs of the culture that builds it.
That is a wonderfully liberating and accurate way to conceptualize the postmodern approach. By permanently abandoning the futile search for a pure or original myth, we finally respect the organic, highly localized, and adaptive nature of human storytelling.
The bricks just keep getting reused.
Hylim analysis essentially proves that all cultures share the same narrative DNA, the same fundamental Lego bricks, yet we use them to construct vastly different, equally valid, and beautifully complex structures to house our respective truths.
And the most incredible part of this entire deep dive is the realization that we have not stopped building. We are still playing with those exact same narrative Lego bricks right now, today, on our glowing screens and in our internet forums.
We certainly are.
Which brings us to the final, incredibly relevant section of our research: modernity, cyberpunk, and the corporation of myth.
Because it is a common misconception to relegate mythology to ancient ruins, dusty library archives, or dead civilizations.
We think of it as ancient history.
But mythological discourse has not vanished. It has merely migrated and expanded exponentially via digital media, the internet, and the global film industry. We are still telling the exact same foundational stories, we just have vastly higher production values and CGI.
The source text explicitly highlights how modern visual storytelling is completely rooted in ancient mythological tradition. Cultural studies scholars frequently cite the Walt Disney Company as a prime example.
Oh, absolutely.
They note that Disney has literally built an empire by reinventing and standardizing traditional childhood myths and folktales for a global mass audience.
And the translation of myth to screen extends far beyond animated fairy tales. The highest-grossing films of our era rely heavily, almost exclusively, on ancient mythic structures.
Like the superhero movies.
Exactly. You have explicit, literal adaptations of the old gods, such as the films Clash of the Titans or Immortals, or the massive success of the Thor franchise within the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Right.
You also see it dominate literature, like Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson series, which literally drops ancient Greek deities directly into modern-day America.
But the Hylims are not always wearing togas and armor. Right. Sometimes the structural bricks are heavily disguised under modern aesthetics.
They are frequently disguised, but the underlying architecture remains identical. Mythic archetypes, such as the cautionary tale of humanity arrogantly abusing divine power or apocalyptic battles with omnipotent godlike entities, are the absolute backbone of modern cyberpunk narratives and blockbuster science fiction films.
So even though there are lasers,
the visual aesthetics may change to neon lights, chrome cybernetics, and space travel, but the structural Hylims driving the plot are as ancient as the Sumerian epics.
we have absolutely not outgrown our need for myth. We have simply updated the delivery mechanism. But the research points to a massive, unprecedented power shift regarding who actually controls these stories, specifically when exploring the phenomenon of fan fiction.
The academic intersection of fan studies and mythology reveals a critical tension in modern culture. The scholar Ika Willis identified 3 distinct models of how fan fiction functions as modern myth.
What's her favorite model?
She specifically favors the concept of a universal story world. Willis argues that fan fiction is inherently mythic because of its hyperseriality.
Unpack hyperseriality for us.
Hyperseriality refers to a hyper-connected narrative universe where characters, plots, and settings are endlessly interwoven, adapted, and expanded upon by a massive community of contributors.
It's just massive.
Yes, it is a collaborative, constantly evolving web of storytelling that refuses to be contained by a single author or a single definitive ending.
It is the exact same phenomenon as Ramanujan's 300 versions of the Ramayana, but applied to modern pop culture. There isn't just one definitive version of the hero's journey. There is a massive, decentralized web of localized variations.
Precisely. But the media scholar Henry Jenkins offers perhaps the most poignant and urgent analysis of this phenomenon.
What does Jenkins say?
Jenkins argues that the explosion of fan fiction is actually modern culture's subconscious attempt to repair profound systemic damage.
Damage from what? What broke the system?
The system was broken by corporate ownership. For the vast majority of human history, myths were transmitted through oral traditions. They were collectively owned by the community, by the folk.
Nobody owned copyright.
Right. Because they were communally owned, they could be altered, localized, adapted, and evolved by anyone to meet the shifting psychological needs of the present moment. Today, however, our most dominant contemporary myths, the globally recognized superheroes, the sprawling space operas, the magical fantasy realms, are legally owned by massive multinational corporations. They are fiercely protected by copyright law and intellectual property rights.
So the universal Lego bricks have been patented, and we are no longer legally allowed to build with them.
Exactly. The historic shift from a fluid oral tradition to rigidly copyrighted intellectual property fundamentally alters the power dynamic of who gets to dictate our cultural values and our models for heroic behavior.
It changes everything.
Fan fiction, according to Jenkins's analysis, is the subconscious rebellion of the populace. It is the folk desperately trying to rip their foundational myths out of the sterile hands of corporate boards and drag them back into the messy, communal, democratic space where they belong.
That reframes internet culture entirely.
Yeah.
So what does this all mean for us? If we accept the premise that myths are a society's foundational operating system, the code that dictates our values, our morals, and our understanding of good and evil, what happens to our collective human psyche when our biggest, most culturally dominant myths are legally classified as corporate intellectual property, locked away behind a monthly streaming subscription? Do we ultimately lose the ability to reprogram our own culture when the code is copyrighted?
It exposes a profound cultural vulnerability. If the narratives that provide our ultimate models for behavior, our definitions of heroism, and our understanding of cosmic justice are dictated solely by corporate profit mandates rather than by organic communal needs, we risk a deep, pervasive cultural alienation.
That is terrifying.
The study of myth teaches us that narrative autonomy is essential for societal health. Fan fiction, therefore, is not merely teenagers writing imaginative stories online. It is a vital, necessary, and ancient reassertion of human narrative autonomy in the face of corporate monopolization.
This has been an unbelievable intellectual journey through the source material. We began by entirely dismantling the colloquial idea that a myth is simply a fake news story or a debunked lie. We explored the rigid but necessary academic boundaries of the folklore ecosystem, distinguishing the primordial weight of myths from the historical continuity of legends and the fictional entertainment of folktales.
It's a complex ecosystem.
It is. We traveled back to the year 1425 to uncover the bizarre English etymology of mythology, realizing that European scholars arrogantly studied the forest of pagan beliefs for 400 years before they ever bothered to name the individual trees.
We waded through the treacherous definitional controversy of labeling the sacred, and we deeply analyzed the 6 psychological theories, explaining why the human mind inevitably invents these stories.
From the historical inflation of euhemerism to the retroactive justifications of ritualism.
Exactly.
We tracked the immense intellectual hubris of 19th century Victorian scholars who thought science would cure everything, and the subsequent psychological awakening of the 20th century led by Freud and Jung. We learned how to deconstruct narratives into microscopic Lego brick high-limbs using 21st century holistics.
The Lego bricks.
And finally, we arrived at the modern era, recognizing that corporate ownership of our most beloved franchises and the subsequent rise of fan fiction is actually a high-stakes battle for control of our cultural operating system.
It is a profound testament to the enduring, inescapable, and vital power of human narrative. We do not outgrow our need for these structures. We merely adapt them to survive our current reality.
As we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day.
Consider your own daily routines, your annual family traditions, or even the unspoken culture of your workplace. If, as the ritualist theory strongly suggests, myths are frequently just retroactive stories we invent to justify forgotten habits, what hidden myth are you actively living out right now without even realizing it?
Oh, that's a good question.
What ancient, forgotten magic are you unwittingly reenacting when you perform your morning routine, when you sit down at your desk, or when you compulsively check your phone every single morning?
It is more than enough to make you look at the mundane structure of your entire day in a completely different light. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Keep unpacking the narratives that surround you. Keep questioning why the cultural code is written the way it is, and we will see you next time.